Fantasy football question. You have three players. They've each scored the same number of points over the last 5 weeks. Who's been the most helpful for fantasy football? The one with the highest FGW.
Yeah, feeling good on a Wednesday.
I'm Byron Cobalt from byron-cobalt.com. Today, we're going to be talking about FGW, or Fantasy Games 1, the statistic I invented in 2021 to do a better job than points at measuring fantasy player performance. This video is going to serve two purposes. The first one is to actually explain the metric, give a little bit of background for the YouTube crowd, because I've already did explain this a little bit in the blog back in 2021. But the second intent of this video is to kick off the 2023 season, where I'll be recapping each week of the fantasy season using this metric to get a little bit of additional insight that you can't get anywhere else. At least I don't believe you can get anywhere else. I haven't checked literally everywhere. All right, without further ado, what is Fantasy Games 1? Well, obviously, in fantasy football, you want your players to score a lot of points. But the point is not the points. The point is the winning of the matchup. So if your players score a lot of points and you lose, you might as well have not scored that much. If you score a ton and you win by a ton, they didn't probably need to score as much. The point is, not all fantasy points are created equal. So what Fantasy Games 1 does is it converts points into a better measure on whether or not you're actually winning your fantasy matchups as a result of the player's performance. So to get started here, there are two main factors for what go into the Fantasy Games 1 metric. And for the first one, we're going to have to bring in our friend, the bell curve.
Want to ring the bell? Ding, ding.
I'm going to give a little bit more detail on these three players that I teased at the beginning of the video. They each scored 40 points over the first 5 weeks of the fantasy season. Hypothetical. Like, I'm filming this before the 2023 season actually starts. They each scored 40 points. This desk keeps shaking. Hold on. It's not a flat floor. They each scored 40 points over 5 weeks. They're all wide receivers, which means that on average, half a point per reception. Their average is going to be about 12 points per week if they're started in a fantasy lineup. That's usually the caliber of player we're talking. Player number 1 scored 8 points in each of the first 5 weeks. So very consistent, but 4 points off the average every week. Player number 2 scored 1, 2, 35, 1, and 1 points, respectively. Player 3 scored 35, 5, and then donuts the rest of the way. So how do we start to convert these numbers into Fantasy Games 1? Your opponent in fantasy football are going to have an expected points curve. It looked like a bell curve. Now, I'm showing up on screen here as an example of one league that I collected the data from back in, this is 2020 data. You can see that around the average is the most common score for your opponents, and then it goes down to the tails. If your data fits a normal curve, you're good to go here. Now, this data doesn't perfectly fit a normal curve, but doesn't have to perfectly fit it, so we're good to go. Best I can tell, the standard deviation of a typical fantasy team scoring is about 17.5 points. That means that the vast majority of the time, 68% of the time, teams are going to be scoring within 17.5 points of the average. For a scoring system, say half PPR, 1 quarterback with a flex spot, only 2 starting wide receivers, kicker and defense, 108 points is going to be about the average. 17 points off of that, so if you're down at around that 91 number, you're going to be winning about 16 or so percent of the time. 17.5 points above that, so once you get up to around 125, you're in the mid-80s percentage, so that's about 84%. I don't know if this exactly matches the numbers I have on screen. I have the screens turned off to reduce reflectivity. This is the first video I'm doing here. I mean, I'm in the basement here, so what do you want from me? Anyway, back to the data. Player number 1, because he's chopped 4 points off your average, has now chopped your win percentage, all else being equal, from being 50-50 in a given week down to about 41%. And you can do this, again, just with standard deviation, normal distribution, bell curve math. So over the course of 5 weeks, you have a 41% chance of winning each week. Poll rolls up to 2.05 expected wins for your team over that period. If your normal expectation was to win half of them, that's an expected win total of 2.5. That means he's cost you 0.45 wins over that period. Player number 2 has a little bit of a different story. Week 1, week 2, I'm going to actually, I'm going to bring up the image here so I can refer to the numbers because I'm not a chump. To restart my computer? Yeah, wonderful. This is a well-oiled machine. I clearly know what I'm doing. All right, there we go. Bootleg. As monitor. All right, player 2 is going to give you a 26% chance of winning with his single point up in week 1, 28% in week 2. Pretty nice week 3. He's got you up to 91%. Again, all else being equal. And then back down to 26% of each of his 1 point weeks. Player 3, meanwhile, is at 91% in week 1, as you can see here. Down to 34% with the 5 burger. And then a couple zeros, leaving you at only 25% chance of winning with without considering any other factors. So if you add this up, can't do math that quickly. I don't know. I can't read from a script. That's the one thing I've learned already. Player 2 has cost you 0.53 wins, and player 3 has cost you 0.5 wins. If you had to choose how to structure points here, you have a slightly better chance of winning if you got the player scoring consistently 8 points per week. 8 points per week. It's below average and consistently below average. The big weeks from players 2 and 3 aren't enough to offset it, especially given how much worse their other weeks are. That's the way the math works out here, and that's the first piece of Fantasy Games 1. But there's a second piece. There's something I didn't tell you about player 3. Player 3 got injured in week 2. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. It was a knee injury. His family was there. They had to stop the game. It was a big thing. Yeah, we don't need to get into that. But he's doing okay now, but he's not in your fantasy lineup, that's for sure. At least if you're actually paying attention to your fantasy lineup, he's out of it. That helps out fantasy owners in certain ways. You know not to start him. So let me ask you this question. If a tree falls in the forest, but you didn't start it on your fantasy team, is there even a point to the metaphor?
Were either of you guys uncertain about anything just now?
The second component of Fantasy Games 1 is the percent started number. We're going to assume that for whatever reason, players 1 and 2 are such highly touted players that you started them 100% of the time each week, despite their performance being a little bit below average. I could have chosen better numbers to reflect this, but the point is still made. So their Fantasy Games 1 numbers are actually fully computed. Negative 0.45 for player 1, negative 0.52 for player 2. For player 3, however, what we do with Fantasy Games 1 is multiply your impact each week. So that's the plus or minus to your win percentage, and multiply it by the percent started. So player 3 in weeks 3, 4, and 5, 0% started because he's hurt. And he's, on a gurney. So you don't want to start him. As a result, those zeros don't directly hurt your fantasy lineup. Player 3 actually has a Fantasy Games 1 stat of 0.41 for week 1, negative 0.16 for that 5 burger. Why I keep calling it that. But then no impact the rest of the way. So plus 0.25. That's the Fantasy Games 1 for player 3. He has helped you by a quarter of a win over this time. He is the player that has helped you the most. If you want a cool example on how Fantasy Games 1 can be a superior statistic than points at evaluating how a player performed over the last season, let's look at 2022. I got 2 quarterbacks for you. Quarterback number 1 scored 284.92 points, and quarterback number 2 scored 286.7. Almost the same number from weeks 1 through 15, which is basically the fantasy season. Their Fantasy Games 1 stats are different. Player 1's Fantasy Games 1, 0.61. Player 2, 0.09. Who are these players? Player 1 is Justin Fields. Player 2 is Trevor Lawrence. That's the value of Fantasy Games 1, is it quantifies how Justin Fields scored his points in a way that you're able to use them, got wins from them. Where Trevor Lawrence was consistent, but not always performing when you expected him to perform. You started him in a few weeks where he didn't do amazingly, and it was a less efficient way for him to really produce those 286 points. That's the Fantasy Games 1 metric. There it is. That's at least the simple version of it. There are some difficult aspects of calculating this. The biggest one being how to actually figure out percent started for players. So if you go back to 2021, when I first launched the metric, Christian McCaffrey got injured in week 4. You like to think that if you looked at the percent started data, I primarily use Yahoo to pull my data. For week 5, I would hope to see his percent started number would be 0. He was not going to play. There was no question about it. His percent started data showed 12% of Yahoo owners still started him. So that's a bit of a problem. That's not really fair to say he's hurting your team just because 12% of fantasy teams are ghost ships by week 5. I guess that's an interesting number to remember when you're signing up for public leagues or something like that. Trying to find a better way to approximate what the real percent started is for the different players amongst active fantasy managers. You can use weekly expert rankings to approximate it. You can just create an equation there and run a regression on it. The problem is weekly rankings aren't updated if you have an injury to a player in, say, pregame warmups. Those late changes will partially be reflected in the real data, but the expert rankings aren't going to be updated enough. So what I do is whichever of the 2 numbers for whether expert predicted start percentage or the actual data, whichever is farther away from 50% is the one I go with, because I take that to be the one that's more likely to be accurate. If experts are predicting a player is going to be started 75% of the time, maybe that player's, like a rank 10 at his position or something like that. But fantasy players are only starting 51% of the time. I'm going to take that 75% as being the better number. But if fantasy players are starting him 0% of the time or 5% of the time, that's the number I'm going to take because something probably happened that's not incorporated in the metric. Between those two, I get what I consider a satisfactory approximation of percent started for fantasy football players. And that's the basic metric. But there's another aspect to the metric. And the reason why there's another aspect here is best explained through a quick story many of us know as the Derrick Henry situation.
I know now why you cry.
I'm going to turn back the clock to 2021 again. Derrick Henry was a Terminator for the first 8 weeks. That's what I kept calling him in the column. Derrick Henry and Cooper Kupp going gangbusters. And then Derrick Henry goes and gets hurt. Despite his invincible nature, he apparently still has human, bones in there, and they're not made of titanium or anything like that, or whatever the Terminator is actually made of. Definitely not that liquid metal thing, because there are moving parts in humans. I don't know why I'm talking about this so much. So Derrick Henry was going to play the rest of the season. I made a bold claim on my blog and got a lot of, when I reposted on Reddit, I got a lot of traffic there. A lot of people complain and say, hey, hold on here. What do you mean Derrick Henry fantasy games 1 number is done for the season? It's a big crater in my lineup now as a first round pick. You know what? They're right. Question is, what is the impact of not having a first round pick in terms of fantasy games 1? That player's not making a direct impact on your team anymore, but they're making an indirect impact. So the way I like to frame this problem is you have 3 costs you inflict in building your team. You have 3 basic resources you can use to get players in place to try and win fantasy games. But you have draft capital, starting lineup spots, where that's an opportunity cost. You put one player in your lineup, that's a spot taken up that someone else can't use, and roster spots. Now, I'll start by saying the roster spots, the cost of keeping a player in your bench and how much it impacts your team, that's very difficult to quantify. I haven't figured it out in an elegant way yet. If anyone has any ideas, I would like to hear a comment. I'd like to hear an idea of how to, again, quantify that in terms of your chances of winning. Yeah, if a player is on your bench, that's a spot on your bench that you're not using for another player that might be in your starting lineup later. We've already talked about the opportunity cost of being the starting lineup. If a player is in your lineup 50% of the time, they help it proportionally to the time they're in your lineup. So that's effectively taken care of here. The draft capital one is a little bit more difficult. I've been working on my equation, on my formula for doing this over the past 2 years, and I think I've come up with the right solution. I've changed the order of operations a few times here. This is not inspired by those mind-numbing, order of operations posts you see on Facebook just inexplicably all the time, where the crux of every single problem is just the division symbol and writing the problems in intentionally ambiguous ways. Just bringing this up is bothering me. What I did fix was an order of operations calculation here on the draft capital allocation for fantasy players. Here's how you can incorporate draft capital into fantasy games 1. I mentioned before that the average score for a wide receiver was 12 points. Well, give an example, running back is about 13.3 points. And this includes also getting some backs in there as in the flex spot. Well, if you draft a running back in the first round, it's about 16 points is the expected number every week. There are 2 tweaks you have to make to a metric to reflect the draft capital. 1, when you compare a player's score, you compare it to the average for what round he was drafted in. And 2, for the percentage of the time you're not starting him, you assume that a replacement player is in his place. So someone getting an average for the lower drafted or free agents in that position. So it's going to be worse than the round they're drafted in, but not like a 0 and not no impact either. Get those 2 modifications on the equation and you have a fantasy games 1 statistic that you can use to measure over the course of the season how much players are helping your team, both directly and indirectly. And there you have it. I hope you'll follow along this year. I'm going to put together a video with every blog post. Going to get it up after the week's over, as soon as I can after the week's over. This is a whole new thing. Like you can tell, I don't really have much of a studio here. I don't have much equipment. I'm filming this on a Polaroid. No, I'm not. This is actually stop motion. I'm just taking a picture and then I'm putting audio to it, and I'm just really good at that. Yeah, but anyway, if you like this, if you enjoy this, encourage you to check out my blog at byron-cobalt.com. I'm going to put up the data, the percent started and expert ranking data every week, where you can support the blog by buying the data for like $1 each week or something like that.
I'd buy that for $1.
It can actually be a lot of work to try and compile those numbers over time. Not to say that I'm the only person with this data, but I've done the work of scraping it for you, and I actually don't know where else to pull it from. I encourage you to subscribe, like, and do all that stuff. I'm not above asking for that. Looking forward to seeing you after week 1. And just remember, we're all going down in this fantasy football ship together.
Come on now! Help me! Together now, Nick!
Right. That's it then.
Goodbye, Molly. Good luck. Goodbye, Molly.
Take a turn around the baby, lower the first tunnel until the deck is